Have you ever been in one of those workshops or presentations or classes where the presenter or teacher or facilitator is just like up in the front of the room and you're just sitting there and it's just like hitting you like a wave? And after an hour or two, the facilitator decides that they're done and they're like, all right, learning accomplished. And as the supposed learner, you're not really sure like if that's true, if you really did learn anything, or at least if you really got out of that experience what you wanted to. Um, as as an educator myself, I know I'm certainly guilty of this, and I definitely see it happening a lot with both new and experienced educators. We all can fall into this trap. Because it's just kind of our dominant model of education. And so, especially when we feel like stressed for time, or we're not really sure what we're doing, or we didn't really prepare or something like that, or if we're just inexperienced and we didn't really plan it enough, that's just what ends up happening is it just turns into like the wave of information. And it's not really the really great like interactive, engaging, thought-provoking learning experience that we want it to be. And so I just want to, in this video, go over a few ways that we can make these learning experiences really engaging for our learners, especially, but also for you as the facilitator, and for you to really get your learning objectives across and to just design a really great learning experience. The learning process, there are a million different theories and models and things like that, but really what it boils down to is the learner has a new experience, and that can look like an idea, some information, a new perspective on something, or a new skill, or something else like that. And then they're able to anchor that to some prior knowledge that they already have. And that can be really basic, but it just means that they are able to contextualize it a little bit, so that reminds me of, I've done something like this before, but like in a different situation, or I already know about this, but I've never thought about it this way, or something like that. And then the most important part is that they're able to construct some meaning out of this new information and out of the connection, because it's so easy to get information. That's not the hard part. And your job as a teacher or facilitator isn't really to get the information across, because I at home can just go online, or I can read a book, or I can watch some YouTube videos, and I can get all the information. But what I really need a skilled facilitator for, or a teacher, is to help me understand what it means and how to apply it. And so when you're teaching a course or something, it doesn't need to be full of just all that information, because they can get that information on their own. You can guide them to the right resources, but they can do that on their own. And really that time you spend together should be about helping them contextualize it, understand the purpose and the meaning behind that information and how it applies to them, what they can do with it. That's really what your job is finding that meaning. So finding connections, deepening understandings, forming opinions, transferring skills into new contexts, things like that. And the learning cycle, I'm not going to go into this really in depth, but I just want you to look at all of these verbs, all these action words on here, because this just demonstrates all of the different active activities we can be doing while we're learning, or while we're teaching. And you will notice, I don't know if there is even on here, listen to a PowerPoint presentation, or listen to somebody read a book for a long time, or listen to somebody lecture. Um, and I don't know about you, but that was what most of my formal education was. You'll notice that most of these verbs are very active. You're doing stuff. You're not passively sitting there receiving that information, right? You're actively doing stuff. Um, and you'll notice that this is a cycle. It starts with connect, more or less, of course, but cycles never end, they never start. But we would begin with connect, and that's that connecting to prior knowledge. The explore is where you would kind of go out and experiment or brainstorm, kind of like gather some information. Or the next step is process, which is where you would contextualize or organize your ideas, really start to kind of like put things in order. And then apply is the really fun step, which is where you get to um, create something, build something, write something, design something, present. This is when you're constructing, you're producing. And then in the transform is where we are taking what we've learned from this whole process, and we are using that information to adapt, to revise, to grow. And so you're offering feedback, you're revising, you're evaluating, you're improving, and then the process continues. And you'll notice in the middle is reflect. Sometimes reflect gets put at the end of this process, but really reflection should be at every stage. You should be reflecting all the time and really evaluating everything that's going on. So going back to this idea of that presenter who's kind of doing like a lecture or PowerPoint presentation, and they're just like overwhelming you with like this wave of information. They would be a really good model of the sage on the stage, which is, again, kind of our dominant example of education in the Western world. And so if you have gone to public school, or you've attended university, you've gone to just about any kind of like workshop or anything like that, you've probably experienced the sage on the stage. This is where the teacher is in front, and the students are all in the back, and the teacher might even have like a little raised platform, or they might be on stage. They might have like a podium. Like they're meant to be presented as very important. The model kind of is based on the assumption that the teacher has all of the knowledge, and that knowledge is kind of a finite resource, and that the knowledge is something that the teacher is the gatekeeper of, that they own the knowledge, and that they are the ones who are deciding who, when, how they get to share that information. An alternative approach, there's obviously many different alternatives to the sage on the stage, but one easy way to examine an alternative is called the guide on the side, which is meant to be more of an egalitarian, democratic approach to learning, where the teacher is metaphorically and maybe even physically taking a step to the side, and they are acting more as a facilitator, a guide, than as a leader. And so the students can have a lot more influence on what they get to learn and how they learn. And this model is really based on this idea that knowledge is infinite, and that it's also a generative resource, in that it is generated by interaction among people, the environment, and through reflection with the self. And so there's no such thing as gatekeeping, because it's a renewable and generative resource. And so just by all of the active learning activities, so all those verbs we just looked at, so all of those really great activities that the students get to do is actively generating knowledge. And they don't have to rely on the teacher deciding to offer them little nuggets. They are the ones who are taking control of their knowledge and their learning, and they get to generate it themselves. And so this is, of course, a very student-centered, a very hands-on approach to learning. I only have a few more things to share with you. One is the spiral curriculum planning model, and this is a really lovely and simple idea. Of course, in permaculture, we love to look at spirals as a really great example of design thinking. And here we're using the spiral as a way to continuously revisit a core concept. It's not just a review each time you revisit the core concept, because as you go out in the circle, you're also increasing in depth and complexity. You might also be connecting the core concept to other concepts that you're learning at that same time. And so you're growing as you go out. This is another example of learning activities. And these are divided into 4 quadrants that are mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual. So they reflect the 4 aspects of self. And then there are 2 spectra, playful to focused, so that's the energy, and then restorative to active. And so this idea is that throughout the day, throughout a project, throughout a course, you really want to be designing whatever kind of learning experience you have to be moving through all of these 4 quadrants. You don't want to be exclusively in just one of these quadrants, because especially if it's just like a mental quadrant, if the whole project is just in the mental quadrant, your students are going to get really drained and exhausted, and they're just going to be really tired. And at some point, you really just need a brain break. And I think we can all relate to this from our academic experiences, where it really did just entirely focus on that mental quadrant, and we really didn't get attention in those other 3 as much as we needed to. And so as best you can, you want to balance those 4 quadrants. And you don't necessarily need to move in any particular order, but just, being mindful. After you have a really intense active listening session, you can move into some really physical work to give the mind a break for a little bit. Then you can move into something that's a bit more emotional, maybe a bit more restorative, like some storytelling or maybe some yoga or some art. Then you can move into some spiritual work, like some meditation or some sit spots and nature journaling. So just moving through, and then by then you'll probably be ready to go back into some more really focused mental work. So just be cycling through these 4 quadrants and trying to stay balanced. The last thing I want to share with you is this idea of backward design. And this was maybe one of my favorite things that I learned in my teacher preparation program, because it seems like such a simple concept once you get it, but before that, it just blew my mind. So people who are maybe less familiar with teaching or facilitation will often approach a course or a workshop, and they'll just think about all of the really awesome activities that they want to do with their group, or all of the cool topics that they want to talk about, and they'll go from there. And that's how you end up with that wave or that waterfall of information. Or you might just get a bunch of activities, and then at the end, your learners are still kind of left with, and they were fun activities, but I'm not really sure how they connected to each other or what the purpose of them all that was. And so before you get to the activities, you need to go back a couple steps. So backward design is starting with your results. You need to identify what you want your learners to know, what do you want them to learn, what do you want them to be able to do. And you want to phrase these as, by the end of this workshop, my students will be able to, and then blank. Fill out a statement like that. And then you need to determine what does it look like for my student to have mastered this skill, or to how do I know that my student has learned this? And this is really the hardest part, because often we can say like, oh, well, I want my student to know the 12 principles of permaculture. Done. That's what I want them to know. Okay, what does that look like? How do you know? How do I know as the teacher that someone has learned that? What does that look like? And so you need to break that down. What does mastery look like? So you often want to change those verbs into something that you can actually measure, or at least observe. So maybe you want them to make a poster of the 12 principles and provide an example of each of those 12 principles. Or maybe you want them to apply each of those principles to their design. Maybe you want them to make a skit where they act out each of the principles. So saying that they will know the principles, really hard to measure that, or to determine if they know it or they don't. But if you get more specific, it gets a lot easier. And so that's how we're determining our evidence. And then we plan our activities. So what activities would support the evidence that I want? So say I wanted, the evidence I wanted was them making a skit, where they have to act out each of those principles. Well, then the activities I would plan would involve practicing those principles, and maybe doing some improv, and then maybe also theater of the oppressed and stuff like that. So my activities support the evidence that I'm looking for. I have found this model really helpful to just go backwards like this. And once you identify those first two, 1 and 2, number 3 gets super easy, and it'll just fall into place. So I hope you found this useful. It's a lot of information. And so I hope you also check out the article with this, and that it supports your learning, and along with the graphics. Just keep practicing and trying things and finding out what doesn't work, and then learning from that and trying again. And each time you will get better and better in your teaching and facilitation.